Hello everybody, it's jrobi. Got another match video I'd like to do, and this took place when I was rated 1489 and my opponent was rated 1562. I'm jrobi playing white, and I'm just going to jump into it here. I opened up with my standard e4 opening, and my opponent played into the Sicilian, played pawn to c5. So from here I just developed knight to f3, and my opponent played d6, and I replied pawn to d4. My opponent captures and I recapture with the knight, and then my opponent gets into sort of a dragon setup here with playing knight to f6. I continue developing knight to c3, defending the pawn here on e4. In this position I've seen a variety of things. I've seen the pawn come immediately down. I've seen the pawn come here to g6. There's a lot of options here for black, but my opponent opted to go into pawn to g6. So from this position here, since nothing was immediately threatened, I developed my own bishop to e3, giving my knight on d4 another defender, and basically developing a piece. So my opponent goes ahead and he fianchettos the bishop, which is what I was expecting, and I develop another piece by moving bishop to e2. So I've got 4 minor pieces developed into play. My opponent's got 2, but my opponent also has open access for the bishop here, so it's definitely not any kind of huge advantage for white. So from this position here, my opponent castles, and I took the opportunity to castle as well. And now my opponent develops knight to c6, and I had a couple options here. The first option that might come to mind is knight captures on c6, but you don't have to look too far into that move to see that it's really not a good move at all for white, simply because after the knight captures here, black can capture back with the pawn, and now all of a sudden black has all of these pawns in the center of the board that are going to come crashing down into the center to control the center, and white is down a center pawn, so it's really not a good move at all to go ahead and capture that knight. So instead what I did is I continued developing, and I got my queen off of the back rank, put her onto d2, and my initial thought at the time was simply I want to get rid of the fianchetto bishop here on g7. The fianchetto bishop in any system that you play usually ends up being a very powerful piece. So as an opposing player, if you can get rid of that somehow, that's definitely to your advantage. My opponent played now, though, pawn to e5, so he's attacking my knight here on d4, but I can just simply swing my knight over to f3. From here, my opponent plays his bishop out to e6, so his bishop still has access to both sides of the board, and is in a better place than it was here on c8, that's for sure. So I just go ahead with my plan now. I want to get rid of the fianchetto bishop. Either A, he's going to capture my bishop and I'll recapture with the queen, or B, if he plays a different move, I'll just capture his bishop anyway. He did play a different move. He played pawn up to d5, attacking my pawn here on e4. So I just go ahead and take the bishop. He recaptures with the king, and then from here now I just capture that pawn. And from this position my opponent captures with the bishop, and I decided to go ahead and capture back with my knight. And I felt that this was a good trade for me in this position, simply because after my opponent recaptures, my opponent's going to have the knight pair, but I'm going to have a knight and a bishop remaining, and you'll notice that the position here is still fairly open, and that just makes this bishop even more stronger as the match progresses, because I'll be able to utilize all these light square diagonals on an open board, as opposed to my opponent, who's going to have to rely strictly on knights. Because the general principle is that when you have an open position, the bishops just gain in strength, whereas when the position is more of a closed type position, knights tend to shine a lot better. So from this position here, I looked at the board and I was thinking what would be a good move for my opponent, and I thought that bringing the knight down to f4 could be very problematic for me, simply because it opens up access to the queens, and doing a queen trade in that position after the knight moves to f4 wouldn't be very good for my position, because I'd probably lose control of the file here, the d file, and really that just doesn't do anything to help me out whatsoever. So I thought I would kind of preemptively stop that, and I played pawn to g3. And I'm looking forward to your feedback on this, but I felt that taking away the f4 square was really important to do at this point in time. And my opponent kind of gave me a positional advantage here. He decided to play queen to a5, and there really is no reason to do a queen trade in this position. And I looked at it for a few minutes because I was trying to see if there was something tactical that he was trying to line up, but it didn't take me long to realize that regardless of what possible tactics there were, doing a queen trade in this position was going to work out really good for me, because once the knight were to recapture on a5, the one defender on the pawn on e5 would be gone, and I can capture that pawn. So I went ahead with the queen trade, and he recaptured with the knight. And now you'll notice that his knight is on the rim, and as the old saying goes, a knight on the rim is grim. But more importantly, this pawn here is now is undefended. But I didn't go for the pawn right away. Instead, I decided to move my rook to d1. I wanted to basically get my rooks going into the match, because it is an open position, and I felt that with the support of my bishop, it would be good to get them into the game right away. And his only two choices for the knight here would be to either retreat the knight or support it with a rook. Either way, I felt that I would still have lots of time to get this pawn. So my opponent decided to move the knight off to f6, and at this point now I can take the pawn. And then my opponent swung his rook over to e8, attacking the knight. But now in this position, I can simply play pawn to f4, giving the knight a defender, because I don't really have much to worry about in terms of the f-pawn coming down anytime soon. So from here, my opponent played knight to c6. So he's getting his knight into a little bit better position on the board, and he's also threatening possibly winning a pawn. He could come in and capture, and then when I recapture with my pawn, he would win the pawn by capturing with the rook. But I did have a good move to stop that, and that was bishop to b5. Now all of a sudden this knight is pinned and can't immediately capture mine. So my opponent decided to play rook to c8, giving the knight a defender, but I figured that now was the time to take away that possible threat of losing a pawn. So I went ahead and captured with the knight. My opponent recaptured with the pawn, and then I moved the bishop to a4. So temporarily still maintaining a pin on this pawn. My opponent from here played pawn to h5, and I knew he was going to try a kingside attack, because really he didn't have anything going on the queen side. His knight is over here on f6, so really his only chances were to come down crashing into my kingside position. But I wasn't too worried about that right away, and instead I played rook to e1. I wanted to do a rook trade. Instead of doing that, though, he pushed his rook over to h8, building up his pressure here on the h-file. But this lets me slide my rook now to e7. So I've got a rook on the 7th, and I've got a lot of options for this rook. So my opponent plays pawn now to h4, and I don't have to worry too much about this right away. So what I did is, instead of doing any kind of capture or moving my king, I simply moved my bishop to b3, and now you'll see that I've got two attackers on this pawn, so he's going to have to do something to defend that. And he plays knight now to d5, attacking my rook, and I figured in this position, with the rook on the 7th, I could just go ahead and capture that knight. And when my opponent recaptured, I felt that I'd have a lot of options on the table. But first things first, I realized I have to defend the pawn on c2, so I pushed that up, and then my opponent now captures on g3, I recapture, and then he plays king now to f6, attacking my rook. And I could have just went in and grabbed this pawn here right away, but I decided that I wanted to do a little bit more positionally instead of that. So I moved my rook now to d7, and I wanted to do that because I wanted to take care of the pawn on d5 before I worried about the pawn on a7. So my opponent plays rook down to h3, attacking my undefended pawn, and I just simply move my king up to g2. My opponent swings his rook over, so I can see that he wants to come down, land the check, and then he'll be able to take my undefended b-pawn. So to kind of take that option off the table, I move my king to f3, and now my opponent brings his rook down to defend the pawn on d5. But from here I can just come in and grab now. He recaptures and I recapture, and now all of a sudden I've got this very powerful rook that has access to all four sides of the board. Wherever I need to swing it to, it can go. So my opponent plays king to e6, trying to bring his king more central position and attacking the rook, and I just swing my rook over to a5. And I wanted my rook there to defend the a2 pawn, because I knew the rook would be coming down soon to try to take advantage of that defended pawn on b2, which is what my opponent played. But now I can simply move that pawn up, and when my opponent played c2, I can simply move that pawn up. So I've got a good pawn chain, well defended, and I'm also attacking the pawn. My opponent checks, and I move my king to g4. Sorry, I'm going a little bit fast, but I'm running out of time here. So my opponent played check on f5, and I moved my king to h4, and I knew that I was in a a dangerous position after my opponent played king to f6 because I was 2 moves away from mate, but I also knew that I had my rook here to deliver a nice check along the 6th rank. So I just took the pawn on a7. My opponent got ready to deliver the mate, but I landed the check, and the only 3 squares his king can go to are on the 7th rank. He moves his king over to g7, and I move mine up. And now he swings his rook over, attacking the undefended pawn on g3, but it's too late because after I deliver check, his king has to move. His king moves to f7, and I just take the other pawn while defending this pawn here on g3. So he takes a pawn on a2, and then he resigned as I was thinking of my next move. So I apologize for my quick ending due to the YouTube time limits, but I'm looking forward to your feedback on the match from both players. So take care, hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.